There are places that exist in that strange territory between memory and myth, between the documented and the dreamed. Places that appear on maps for centuries and then vanish without explanation. Places that sailors swore they had seen with their own eyes, had landed upon, had walked across, only to return and find that the coordinates led to nothing but empty ocean. Places that seemed to flicker in and out of existence like a candle flame in a drafty room, like a thought you almost remember, like a name on the tip of your tongue that dissolves the moment you try to speak it. This is the story of such a place. An island that appeared on maps for nearly 500 years. An island that dozens of expeditions claimed to have discovered. An island that kings and merchants and adventurers sought with an obsession that bordered on madness. An island that may never have existed at all, or that may exist still, just beyond the edge of our perception, waiting in the fog. This is the legend of Hy-Brasil, the impossible island, the phantom in the Atlantic, the place that cartographers drew with such precision and such certainty, and that the ocean steadfastly refused to contain. Close your eyes and imagine the medieval world as it appeared to those who drew the first maps. The known world was small, bounded by the Mediterranean and the coasts of Europe, by Jerusalem in the east and the western edge of Ireland, beyond which lay only mystery. The ocean was not a space to be crossed, but a wall to be feared, a liquid desert populated by monsters and demons, by whirlpools that could swallow a ship whole, by magnetic rocks that would pull the iron nails from a vessel's hull, by sea serpents, and by the very edge of the world itself, where the water poured off into some unimaginable void. But even in this geography of terror, there were dreams. There were whispered stories of lands beyond the sunset, of islands blessed by God, of places where saints had fled to escape the corruption of the world, of paradises where it was always summer and where death held no dominion. These were the islands of the blessed, the fortunate isles, the lands that existed somewhere in that impossible west, hidden in the mists, waiting to be found by those pure enough or brave enough or lucky enough to pierce the veil. In Irish mythology, these phantom islands had names. There was Tir na Nog, the land of youth, where time did not flow and where the Tuatha De Danann, the old gods, had retreated after the coming of mortals. There was Mag Mell, the plain of honey, a realm of beauty and abundance that existed beneath the waves or beyond the horizon, depending on which story you heard. And there was an island whose name appears again and again in the old tales, sometimes as Hy-Brasil, sometimes as Hy-Brasil, sometimes as Brasil or Brasil or Obrasil or any of a dozen other variations, as if even the name itself were unstable, shifting like the mists that supposedly surrounded it. The name is ancient, and its meaning is uncertain. Some scholars believe it comes from the Irish words bres, meaning beautiful or noble, and isle, meaning island or rock. The beautiful island, the noble rock. Others connect it to the Irish word for fortune or luck, the fortunate isle. Still others point to a darker etymology, suggesting connections to the old Celtic otherworld, to the realm of the dead, to the place where the sun goes when it sets, to the threshold between this world and the next. But whatever its name meant, whatever its origins in Celtic mythology, something extraordinary happened in the medieval period. Hy-Brasil stopped being merely a legend. It started appearing on maps, real maps. Maps drawn by serious cartographers, maps used by navigators, maps that showed the coasts of Europe and Africa with increasing accuracy as the age of exploration began. And there, invariably located somewhere off the western coast of Ireland, was an island, Hy-Brasil. Drawn with the same confidence, the same precision, the same cartographic authority as Spain or England or the coast of Africa. The first confirmed appearance is on the Catalan Atlas of 1375, one of the most important medieval maps in existence. There, drawn by the hand of Abraham Cresques, the master cartographer of Majorca, is a large circular island off the Irish coast, labeled with care and precision. And from that moment forward, Hy-Brasil appears again and again. On the map of Juan Pizzigano in 1424, on the famous map by Andrea Bianco in 1436, on the Catalan Atlas world map of 1450, on chart after chart, atlas after atlas, drawn by different hands, in different cities, in different decades, but all agreeing on the essential fact. There is an island in the Atlantic Ocean, west of Ireland, and its name is Hy-Brasil. The descriptions are remarkably consistent. The island is usually depicted as circular or semicircular, often shown bisected by a river or channel running east to west, dividing it into two roughly equal halves. Sometimes it is shown with a single name. Sometimes it is labeled as two separate islands, the northern and southern portions given different names, but the shape persists. The perfect circle, the dividing line. As if the cartographers were copying from some original source, some template, some shared vision of what this impossible island looked like. And here is where the mystery deepens into something stranger, something that begins to feel less like a simple cartographic error and more like a doorway into a different kind of reality. Because as the decades passed and as European ships began to venture farther into the Atlantic, as the age of exploration turned the ocean from a barrier into a highway, expeditions began to claim that they had found it, that they had seen Hy-Brasil with their own eyes, that they had landed upon its shores and walked upon its soil and met its inhabitants. The year is 1480. A letter is recorded in the archives written by one Pedro de Ayala, describing an expedition sent from the port of Bristol in England. The letter states that ships sailed from Bristol in search of the island of Brazil. These were not idle dreamers or fantastical storytellers. These were merchants, professional sailors, men whose livelihoods depended on accurate navigation and reliable information. And they were investing money and risking their lives to find an island that, according to the maps, should exist, that, according to the legends, held untold riches, that, according to the whispers, had been seen by others.
But it is in 1497 that the story takes on its most concrete and most perplexing dimension. A letter surfaces, written by a man named John Day to Christopher Columbus himself, discussing recent explorations from Bristol. In this letter, Day mentions that Bristol men have been searching for Hy-Brasil for years, and he writes something extraordinary. In otros tiempos se falló la isla de Brasil. In other times, the island of Brazil was found. Not that they were looking for it, not that they hoped to find it, but that it had been found. Past tense. Accomplished fact. Who found it? When? The letter does not say, but it speaks of this discovery as something known, something accepted, something that could be referenced casually in a letter to the greatest navigator of the age. And then the trail goes cold. If there were maps of this discovery, they have been lost. If there were logs from these voyages, they have disappeared. If there were samples brought back, treasures claimed, proof established, it has all vanished into the mists of history as completely as the island itself vanishes into the mists of the Atlantic. But the stories persist. In 1674, a Scottish captain named John Nisbet was supposedly caught in a storm off the Irish coast and blown far to the west. When the storm cleared, he and his crew found themselves within sight of land, an island. They landed and explored. They found the island was inhabited. The people they met were strange, speaking a language they could not understand, wearing clothes of an unfamiliar style. The inhabitants showed them the island, which was prosperous and beautiful, rich with forests and clear streams. Nisbet and his crew stayed for a day and then sailed home, returning to Scotland with stories of the mysterious island they had found in exactly the location where the old maps said Hy-Brasil should be. 4 years later, in 1678, a second ship claimed to have landed on the same island. Captain Alexander Johnson, along with the crew that included several men who had sailed with Nisbet, reported finding the island again. They gave the same description, they reported the same strange inhabitants, and they brought back something physical, something tangible. Silver. or so the stories claim. Objects made of silver that they said the islanders had given them, proof that they had been there, evidence that this was not merely a shared delusion or a sailor's tale grown in the telling. The accounts are frustratingly vague on details. What did the silver look like? Where did it go? What happened to these objects that could have proven the existence of Hy-Brasil beyond doubt? Like so much else in this story, they evaporate. They disappear. They exist only in the realm of "it is said" and "reportedly" and "according to the accounts." They shimmer at the edge of historical fact and then dissolve when you try to look at them directly. And yet, the maps continue. Even after these supposed discoveries, even as the Atlantic is more thoroughly explored and charted, even as new technologies and better instruments make navigation more precise, Hy-Brasil remains.
It appears on Abraham Ortelius's world map of 1570, on the Mercator map of 1595, on countless atlases and charts through the 1600s. Cartographers are beginning to map the coastlines of the Americas with increasing accuracy. They are charting the Caribbean islands, the northern reaches of Canada, the coastlines of Africa and Asia. The world is becoming known. The blank spaces on the map are filling in.
But there, off the coast of Ireland, the phantom island persists. Hy-Brasil, Brazil Rock, O Brazil. The names shift slightly from map to map, but the location is consistent. Approximately 51 degrees north latitude, approximately 15 degrees west longitude. Out in the Atlantic, beyond the reach of land, in a location where modern surveys tell us there is nothing but deep ocean, nothing but dark water stretching down thousands of feet to an abyssal plain, nothing but empty sea. Walk with me now through the halls of the great libraries and archives of Europe. The British Library in London, the Bibliothèque Nationale de France in Paris, the Archivo General de Indias in Seville, the National Archives of Ireland, of Portugal, of Spain. Descend into their climate-controlled vaults where the old maps are kept, those precious documents drawn on vellum and parchment, colored with faded inks, marked with the careful notations of men who believed they were documenting reality. Lay them out side by side, these maps from different centuries, different countries, different cartographic traditions, and watch as the phantom island appears again and again, drawn with such confidence, labeled with such certainty. The cartographers were not fools. They were the scientists of their age, the technicians of spatial knowledge, men who understood longitude and latitude, who could calculate angles and distances, who knew the difference between legend and observation. And yet they placed Hy-Brasil on their maps with the same assurance they used to place England and France and Spain. Why? If the island did not exist, why did it appear on map after map for centuries? If it was merely a legend, why did professional navigators waste time and resources searching for it? If it was a simple mistake, why did the mistake propagate so consistently with such similar details across so many different sources? There are practical explanations, of course. Historians and cartographers have proposed several. Perhaps it began as a misidentification. Perhaps a sailor, caught in the complex currents and fogs of the North Atlantic, caught a glimpse of one of the actual islands off Ireland's coast, Arran or Islay, saw them from an unusual angle, estimated their distance incorrectly, and believed they had found a new island farther west than it should be. Perhaps they reported this to a cartographer, and the cartographer added it to a map. Perhaps other cartographers, lacking better information, copied it from that first map. And so the error propagated, spreading from chart to chart, achieving a kind of false legitimacy through repetition. Or perhaps it was a phantom island, a real geographic phenomenon, but a temporary one. Perhaps it was an ice island, a massive berg that had broken off from the Arctic ice sheet and drifted south, large enough and stable enough to be mistaken for land. Perhaps it was a floating mat of vegetation, pumice from a volcanic eruption, some combination of atmospheric conditions and ocean currents that created the appearance of land where there was none.
Perhaps sailors really did see something that was there one year and gone the next, something that existed on the borderline between the substantial and the ephemeral.
Or perhaps it was a deliberate fabrication. Some historians suggest that the Bristol merchants who searched for Hy-Brasil were engaged in a kind of commercial deception, claiming to search for a legendary island, while in fact they were fishing in rich grounds off the coast of Newfoundland, grounds they wanted to keep secret from competitors. Perhaps the story of Hy-Brasil was a cover, a misdirection, a way to explain where their ships were going and why they returned with holds full of cod and other riches. Perhaps the Phantom Island was a smokescreen for very real and very profitable enterprises that they wished to keep hidden. These are rational explanations, reasonable explanations, the kind of explanations that satisfy the modern mind, that restore order to the chaos of the inexplicable. They are probably correct, almost certainly correct. Some combination of these factors, honest error and deliberate deception, and the strangeness of the ocean itself, is surely sufficient to explain why an island that did not exist appeared on maps for half a millennium. And yet, something in these explanations feels incomplete. Something about the story resists this neat resolution. Perhaps it is the consistency of the descriptions. Perhaps it is the seriousness with which serious men pursued it. Perhaps it is that curious phrase in John Day's letter to Columbus, "The island of Brazil was found." Not sought, not rumored, not hoped for, but found. As a statement of fact, communicated to one of the greatest navigators in history. Or perhaps it is something deeper, something that touches on the way we understand reality itself, on the way we draw the line between the real and the unreal, the possible and the impossible. Because if you think about it carefully, there is something profoundly strange about an island that appears on maps, but not in the ocean. An island that exists cartographically, but not physically. An island that has a definite location, a consistent description, a documented history of searches and claimed discoveries, but that nevertheless does not exist. Where exactly is Hy-Brasil? If we say it does not exist, we mean it does not exist in physical space, in the objective external world that can be measured and surveyed. But it exists in other spaces, doesn't it? It exists in the maps. It exists in the letters and the reports. It exists in the minds of the men who searched for it. It exists in the stories that were told about it for hundreds of years. It exists in the imagination of every person who has heard its name and felt that little shiver of wonder, that little spark of curiosity about the island that shouldn't be there, but somehow is. In folklore and in mythology, in the tales told around fires and in the songs sung by the old people, Hy-Brasil is not just an island. It is a threshold, a liminal space, a place that exists between worlds, between the mortal realm and the other world, between the mundane and the magical. It is an island that appears and disappears according to its own mysterious schedule, visible only to certain people at certain times under certain conditions that cannot be predicted or controlled.
The stories say that Hy-Brasil is hidden by an enchantment, shrouded in mist that prevents ordinary sailors from seeing it. The mist lifts only once every 7 years, and only for a single day. On that day, the island becomes visible, solid, as real as any land on Earth. But for the other 6 years and 364 days, it is veiled, removed from the world, existing in some parallel space that occupies the same coordinates as the empty ocean, but cannot be reached or perceived by those who lack the key to the enchantment.
The stories say that if you want to find Hy-Brasil, you must throw fire onto the island. Some say this means you must throw a flaming brand or torch onto its shores. Others say you must light a fire on the island itself, and that this act of bringing human flame to the enchanted land will break the spell and make the island permanent, fixed in the world, no longer able to slip away. But who can throw fire onto an island they cannot see? Who can land on shores that appear and disappear like a dream? The stories say that the island is inhabited by a race of people who are not quite human, or who are human but not quite mortal. Some tales call them the Tuatha De Danann, the old gods of Ireland who retreated from the world when Christianity came, who made their home in the hollow hills and the blessed islands beyond the sea. Some call them sorcerers or druids, keepers of ancient knowledge, practitioners of arts that have been lost to the wider world. Some simply call them the people of Hy-Brasil, a race unto themselves, neither entirely of this world nor entirely of the other. And the stories say that if you do manage to reach the island, if you are one of the fortunate few who arrives on that single day when the mist lifts, if you walk upon its shores and speak with its inhabitants, you must be very careful about what you do and what you take. For the island operates under different laws than the world you know. Time moves differently there. What feels like a day may be a year in the world outside. What feels like an hour may be a decade. And if you take something from the island, if you carry away so much as a stone or a flower or a piece of wood, you may find that it crumbles to dust in your hands the moment you return to ordinary reality. Or you may find that it has bound you to the island, that it calls you back, that you can never again be content in the mortal world because you have touched something that mortal world cannot contain. These are the old stories, the folklore, the mythology. We are not supposed to believe them, not literally. We are supposed to understand them as metaphors, as cultural expressions of deeper psychological truths, as the way pre-scientific people made sense of a world they did not fully understand. We are supposed to smile indulgently at the naivety of our ancestors who believed in enchanted islands and races of immortals and mists that could hide entire lands from view. But consider this. What if the maps were not wrong? What if the sailors were not lying or mistaken? What if Hy-Brasil does exist, but not in the way we assume things exist? What if it occupies a different category of reality, a different mode of being, something that our modern epistemology has trouble accommodating? Think about the nature of islands. An island is defined by its boundaries, by the edge where land meets water. But those boundaries are not fixed. They change with the tides. At high tide, an island is one size. At low tide, it is larger. In some cases, what appears to be an island at high tide is revealed to be a peninsula at low tide, connected to the mainland by a strip of land that spends most of its time underwater. In some cases, what appears to be several separate islands at high tide merges into a single landmass at low tide. So islands are, in a very real sense, things that appear and disappear on a regular cycle. They're not quite as permanent, quite as stable, quite as definitely existent as we tend to think. Their existence is contingent, dependent on conditions, variable. Now, extend this concept. Suppose there are cycles longer than the tidal cycle. Suppose there are rhythms in nature, rhythms in the ocean or in the atmosphere or in something else we do not yet understand that operate on scales of years instead of hours. Suppose that under certain rare combinations of conditions that repeat at long intervals, the ocean's surface does something strange. Perhaps it reflects light differently. Perhaps atmospheric refraction creates an image of something that is not there, or makes visible something that is ordinarily hidden below the surface. Perhaps there are upwellings, currents, temperature gradients that, under the right circumstances, can create effects that resemble land, that can fool the eye and the instruments, that can exist briefly as a kind of hybrid between the real and the illusory. This is not magic, this is not mysticism, this is simply acknowledging that the ocean is stranger and more complex than we often remember, that atmospheric optics can create remarkable effects, that our eyes and our instruments can be fooled in ways that are entirely natural but nevertheless profoundly uncanny. And if such conditions can create the appearance of an island where there is no land, and if those conditions repeat on a long cycle, perhaps every 7 years as the legends say, perhaps at some other interval, then you would have exactly what the legends describe, an island that appears and disappears, that can be found by lucky sailors at rare intervals, that exists at other times only as a memory and a hope. Or consider another possibility, one that is stranger still, but that finds some support in modern physics and cosmology. Suppose that space itself is not quite as simple, quite as uniform, quite as stable as we assume. Suppose there are regions where the normal rules are slightly different, where the constants are not quite constant, where the boundaries between here and there, between now and then, are more permeable than we believe. We know that space is curved by gravity, that massive objects create distortions in the fabric of space-time, that near a black hole or a neutron star, space and time behave in ways that would seem impossible to us. But those are extreme examples. What if there are smaller effects, subtler distortions, places for reasons we do not understand? The geometry of space is slightly abnormal, slightly folded, slightly connected to somewhere else. What if Hy-Brasil is real, physically real, but exists in a kind of spatial fold, a pocket of space that is adjacent to our Atlantic Ocean, but not quite coincident with it? What if the coordinates on the old maps are correct, but the island exists at a slight angle to our three-dimensional space, visible only when the angle shifts, accessible only when the fold aligns properly? This sounds like science fiction. It probably is science fiction. But the boundary between science fiction and scientific speculation is not always as clear as we might think. And if you had told medieval cartographer that the Earth was not the center of the universe, that it was a sphere rotating in empty space around a star, that there were billions of other stars, each with their own systems of planets, that light had a finite speed, and that looking at distant objects meant looking back in time, they would have called that fantasy as well.
The point is not that Hy-Brasil exists in some hidden dimension or parallel reality. The point is that our certainty about what does and does not exist, about what is and is not possible, should perhaps be tempered with a bit more humility. The world has surprised us before. It will surprise us again. In 1865, something remarkable happened. The British Admiralty conducted a comprehensive survey of the North Atlantic, using the best instruments and methods available. They sent ships to the coordinates where Hy-Brasil had been reported for centuries. They took soundings of the ocean depth. They measured, they recorded, they searched. They found nothing. Deep ocean, no island, no rock, no shallows, nothing but water, hundreds of fathoms deep, extending as far as their instruments could measure. The report was definitive, conclusive, final. There was no island at that location. There never had been an island at that location. The ocean floor was far too deep for any island to exist there. And so, with the authority of science and government and modern surveying technology behind them, the British Admiralty removed Hy-Brasil from their maps. After nearly 500 years of cartographic existence, the Phantom Island was officially declared non-existent. The maps were corrected, the charts were amended. The place where Hy-Brasil had been shown was left blank, marked only with numbers indicating the depth of the ocean. Other nations followed suit. One by one, the cartographers of Europe removed the island from their atlases.
By the end of the 19th century, Hy-Brasil had been erased from the official maps of the world. The age of mythology was over. The age of precision had begun. The Atlantic Ocean was empty of phantom islands, empty of enchantments, empty of anything that could not be measured and verified and documented according to the rigorous standards of modern science. And that should be the end of the story. The legend explained, the mystery solved, the phantom island revealed as nothing more than a cartographic error that persisted for centuries until proper surveying techniques finally laid it to rest. A curious historical footnote, a reminder of how far we have come from the superstitious ignorance of our ancestors. But of course, it is not the end, because legends do not die simply because they are removed from maps. Stories do not cease simply because scientists declare them impossible. And sometimes the map is not quite the same thing as the territory. In the archives of the Irish Folklore collection, housed at University College Dublin, there are recorded interviews from the early 20th century, old people from the western coast of Ireland, people who grew up hearing the stories from their grandparents, who grew up in a world where the boundary between history and legend was never quite clear. And when the collectors asked them about Hy-Brasil, they told stories.
They told of fishermen who claimed to have seen it out in the Western Ocean on certain evenings when the light was strange and the air was very clear. A dark shape on the horizon that should not be there. An island where the charts showed only empty sea. They would sail toward it, and as they sailed it would seem to recede, always remaining the same distance away no matter how far they traveled. Or they would look away, look back, and it would be gone, vanished, as if it had never been there, leaving only empty ocean, and the fishermen wondering if they had seen it at all, or if it had been a trick of the light, a mirage, a vision. They told of a belief that survived even into the 20th century, even into the age of motorboats and radio and GPS, that Hy-Brasil was still out there, still hidden by its enchantment, still waiting to be found by someone pure enough or clever enough or lucky enough to break the spell. They told of the old prohibition, still remembered, still sometimes observed: never point directly at the place where you think you saw it. Never speak its name aloud when you are at sea. To do so is to offend the island, to ensure that it will never appear to you again. And they told stories that were presented not as legends, but as recent events, as things that had happened to people they knew, to cousins and neighbors and fellow fishermen. Stories of men who had disappeared at sea and returned days later with no memory of where they had been, their boats found drifting far from where they should have been, their clothes dry though they had been lost in a storm. Stories of catches that included fish that should not exist in those waters, species that belong to warmer seas or deeper ocean. Stories of objects found floating, carved wood or worked metal, in styles that belonged to no known culture, that the museums could not identify, that seemed very old and very new at the same time. These are not evidence, these are not proof. These are stories, and stories are slippery things, unreliable, subject to embellishment and misremembering, and the human tendency to find patterns where there are none. But they are also something else. They are a record of persistence, of a legend that refuses to die, of a belief that survives in the face of official denial, that continues to live in the imagination and in the oral tradition long after it has been erased from the maps. Stand on the western coast of Ireland on a clear evening as the sun sets over the Atlantic. Stand at the edge of the land, at the point where the green fields and gray stone walls give way to the cliffs that drop down to the sea. Watch as the light changes, as the sky turns from blue to gold to violet, as the ocean shifts from gray to silver to something darker and more mysterious. Watch the horizon, that perfect line where the sea meets the sky, that boundary between the known and the unknown, and allow yourself, just for a moment, to wonder. What if the maps were right and the surveys were wrong? What if the sailors were telling the truth and the scientists were missing something? What if the island is there, just beyond the edge of perception, existing in a frequency or dimension or mode of being that our instruments are not calibrated to detect? What if right now, at this very moment, as you watch that horizon, the mist is lifting? What if today is the day, the one day in 7 years when the enchantment weakens and the island becomes visible? What if all you would have to do is wait and watch and believe just a little bit and you would see it? The dark shape emerging from the haze, the outline of an island that should not exist, the shores of Hy-Brasil appearing like a memory surfacing from the depths of a forgotten dream.
You will not see it, of course. The island is not there. Science has proven this beyond any reasonable doubt. The Atlantic Ocean, at 51 degrees north, 15 degrees west, contains nothing but deep water, empty and cold and utterly devoid of land. The surveys have been done, the data has been collected, the question has been settled. But just for a moment, just for the space of a breath, allow yourself to feel what those old sailors felt, that mixture of hope and fear, that sense of possibility, that understanding that the world is larger and stranger than we can ever fully comprehend, that the ocean keeps its secrets, that there are still mysteries hidden in the margins between the known and the unknown. The legend of Hy-Brasil is, in the end, a story about the power of possibility. It is about the human need to believe that there are still undiscovered places, still hidden wonders, still regions of the map that are blank, not because they contain nothing, but because they contain something we have not yet learned how to see. It is about the stubborn refusal of imagination to be constrained by fact, the insistence of wonder in the face of evidence, the way that stories can be more real than reality, or at least more meaningful, more necessary, more deeply true in ways that have nothing to do with whether they are literally, factually, scientifically accurate. The maps no longer show Hy-Brasil. The island has been erased, deleted, removed from the official record of the world. But it has not been forgotten. It persists in the stories, in the folklore, in the dreams of those who still look westward from the Irish coast and wonder what might be hidden beyond the horizon. It persists in the name Brazil, which was given to that vast country in South America, not because of the famous red dye wood found there, as is commonly supposed, but possibly because early explorers believed they had found the island of legend, transplanted somehow to the western side of the Atlantic, real at last, after centuries of phantom existence. It persists in the hearts of everyone who has ever felt the pull of the horizon, who has ever looked at a map and wondered about the blank spaces, who has ever felt that there must be more to the world than what we have been told, more than what we can measure and quantify and reduce to data points. Hy-Brasil is gone from the maps, but it has not disappeared. It has simply returned to where it always truly existed, in the realm of story, of myth, of the things we believe in despite the evidence, or perhaps because of our need for mystery, for wonder, for the possibility that the world contains more magic than we have been led to expect.
And perhaps that is where it belongs. Perhaps it is better as a legend than as a discovered fact. Perhaps if someone did finally find it, if they sailed through the mist and landed on its shores and mapped its dimensions and brought back photographs and soil samples and documentary proof of its existence, something essential would be lost. The island would become ordinary, explicable, subject to the same rules as every other island. It would no longer be Hy-Brasil, it would just be an island. But as long as it remains undiscovered, as long as it exists only in the stories and the old maps and the imagination, it remains perfect, untouchable, eternal. It remains the island that might be there, that could be there, that is there in every way that matters except the merely physical. So the legend persists. The phantom island haunts the Atlantic still, not on the surface of the water, but in the depths of the human mind. In that place where the line between memory and imagination dissolves, where what we remember and what we dream become indistinguishable, where the impossible and the real occupy the same space, flickering in and out of existence like a candle flame, like a thought half remembered, like an island that appears on maps for 500 years and then vanishes without a trace. Somewhere out there, in the mist and the waves, beyond the horizon, just past the edge of what we can see and measure and prove, Hy-Brasil waits. It has always been waiting. It will always be waiting. And perhaps that is the deepest truth of the legend. Not that the island exists, but that we need it to exist. That we need there to be places beyond our reach, mysteries beyond our solving, wonders beyond our explaining. The island that shouldn't exist but does, in that strange country between the real and the imagined, between the map and the territory, between what we know and what we dream. The island that is gone from the maps, but never truly lost, because it was never truly found. Hy-Brasil, the impossible island, the phantom in the Atlantic, the place that exists because we believe in it, or that we believe in because it exists, or both, or neither, or something else entirely that we have no words for, no way to explain, no choice but to wonder about as we stand at the edge of the land and stare out into the endless sea.